I sat at the grand piano, Mortimer's work mounted on an ornate oak music stand. The stand was one that I had acquired some 15 years earlier. It was said to have once belonged to the famed occultist Ezekiel Pulcinella. It seemed apt. The house was eerily silent. I had dismissed all of my staff for the evening to eliminate any risk of interruption. A moment like this was to be savored. I would not allow anything or anyone to spoil it. I cracked my knuckles, lumbering up my fingers, then licked my lips in anticipation. The still air seemed to hum and crackle. It was as if the world itself was as eager as I to hear Mortimer's work. Very well, I whispered to myself. Let's begin. I stumbled into my bedroom 30 minutes later, my mind racing, my heart pounding. I stumbled, grasping the doorframe for support. How had he done that? I'd never believed a piano capable of making such sounds. Even now I could hear it in my mind, the unmistakable thudding of the cleaver, the rending of flesh, the squeals and cries of livestock as they met their end, even the anguished tears of men and women as they beheld their own ruination at otherworldly hands. It was not just music. It was a swirling lament, an evocation of the lifetime of bloodletting and misery that butcher, that monster, that maestro had witnessed. Playing it had been exhausting. Hearing it had been horrifying. Experiencing it had been exhilarating. I collapsed onto my bed, too physically drained to disrobe, the Abattoir Concerto still swirling around my addled mind. I stared up at the ceiling, unseeing in the inky darkness of the night, and grinned euphorically. As I sank into the waiting embrace of sleep, my body succumbing at last to the rigors of performing Lucien Mortimer's eldritch work, my fingers writhed and twitched of their own accord. It was as if they were already yearning to play it again. The dream came almost instantly. At first it was sounds, even smells, the imagery not coming until later. I heard the clink of chains, the squeal of metal scraped on metal, and the huffing breathing of beasts. I could smell the rank odor of their bodies, the musk of creatures in an enclosed space mingling with the pungent smell of dung and the acrid ammonia stench of urine. Yet there was something else, a scent that lurked just beneath these. Barely there, yet somehow permeating everything. The coppery tang of blood. The dream was full of the sounds and smell of fear, the sounds and smell of the abattoir. So it came as a surprise when the fog of sleep obscuring my vision slowly dispersed and revealed an empty, abandoned slaughterhouse. It was an old building, the paint flaking from damp, bulged walls in multiple places, a thick layer of dust coating the rusty iron rails that separated the narrow walkways that wound through the empty animal pens. The wooden floors of these livestock enclosures and the cramped runs that linked them still bore some sparse, brittle bunches of prehistoric straw and large, dirty, brown clots of sawdust. The floor itself had a pinkish tinge, evidence of too many failed attempts to wash away spilled blood. The place seemed huge, and as I took my first faltering step, it produced a cavernous echo that reverberated around the building. I moved slowly, following the designated path between the pens. Despite the emptiness that my eyes presented me with, the sounds and smells of the abattoir continued. The building was uncomfortably hot, possessed of the sticky humidity of hundreds of bodies crammed into a small space. About me, the grunts and snuffles of livestock became louder and louder, causing me to wince a little as I made my way unsteadily into the depths of the building. The feeling of overwhelming dread that washed over me seemed to coincide with the first squeal. Despite the hubbub, I heard it straight away, a high-pitched shriek of an animal terror. It was a desperate, hopeless sound, the sound of a beast on the butcher's block. Somewhere among the throng of invisible creatures, another cry rang out, another piercing scream of dismay. This one seemed closer, louder, and the proximity of its fear caused my swelteringly hot body to turn cold. The animal's shriek was joined by another, and another, and another. One by one, each of the beasts joined the sickening chorus of abject horror, the volume of their cries of anguish rising to a deafening level. I clamped my hands over my ears in a futile attempt to muffle the screams, yet still the volume rose, hammering into my ears like rusty nails. This was not a mere sound, it was a sensation I could feel within my chest. Pure, undiluted bestial fear. It became so loud, so overwhelming, that it drove me to my knees on the grime-encrusted floor, a cry of desperation springing from my own lips and blending with that of the livestock. The wave of sound beat down on me, a rain of hammer blows that left me dizzy, driving the air from my lungs and tears from my eyes. Then, just as I thought I could stand it no more, the slaughterhouse fell silent. I cautiously lowered my hands, panting like an exhausted dog. A hot, fresh puddle of vomit lay before me. I had no recollection of heaving it out onto the filthy floor, but an aching sensation in my stomach and a vile taste at the back of my throat confirmed that I most certainly had. My eyes streamed and I wiped at them with the back of my hand, then climbed to my feet, trembling as I did so. Now the dilapidated slaughterhouse was eerily silent, the rasping sound of my hitching breaths and the metronomic clip-clop of my footsteps in their Italian leather brogues, the only noise is to pierce the still and dusty air. Ahead of me I noticed a rickety iron stairway that ascended up to cobweb-shrouded catwalks suspended precariously from the ceiling. I cursed aloud. I had no intention to risk life and limb on those skeletal, age-ravaged structures, and began to look for an alternative means of exit. But the expletive I muttered was not met with silence. Instead, it seemed to act as a cue for an unseen musician somewhere deep in the bowels of the building. For the echo of my voice had barely faded before a loud and jarring slam on a piano's keys caused me to cry out again. My heart pounded in my chest, a feeling of utter terror washing over me as again the piano surrounded, and I realized I was listening to the opening notes of the Abattoir Concerto. No. Oh, God, no. I muttered to myself as I scurried back the way I had come, suddenly desperate to be free of the accursed slaughterhouse. A sick feeling of dread washed over me as I realized that I was heading towards the piano. I froze then, unsure what to do, paralyzed with indecision. The mesmerizing rhythm of the Abattoir Concerto continued, seeming to fill the air. Or did it? There were other sounds, too. The clinking and scraping of chains being dragged toward me. It was the recognition of that sound that spurred me into action. Yes, the rusted catwalks might be dangerous, but I would sooner take my chances with them than with the chained pianist. My footsteps on the iron stairs sent deafening booms through the slaughterhouse, the stairs shaking and lurching alarmingly beneath me. Yet more terrifyingly still was the noise that met my echoing footsteps. An increased and more agitated clinking of chains, as if whatever was dragging them had been excited by the sound of my retreat. When I reached the top of the stairs, I made the terrible mistake of peering down at the dirty floor below. I was at least 30 feet in the air, a realization that caused me to grip the filthy handrail for dear life, causing it to shed flakes of rust that stained my palms. The catwalks were in ill repair. At several points, my passage caused nuts, bolts, and even chunks of metal to plummet to the floor below with a deafening clang, while dust and dirt rained down about me from the supports that attached them to the ceiling. With a shudder, I noticed that catwalks continued on into the bowels of the building, terminating in a hungry-looking doorway to an attic. I froze again, contemplating my next move. It was while I stood in that thought that I glanced back in the direction from which I had come and saw movement. At first, I wasn't sure I'd seen it. I suspected it was just a trick of my tired eyes or fearful imagination. But then I saw it again, and there could be no mistaking it this time. It was something dark and huge, scurrying through the walkways between the animal pens with a deadly air of purpose. It was a figure, unnaturally tall and long-limbed, trailing rusty, glinting chains behind it. It was only when I realized that the monstrous figure was heading for the base of the rickety staircase I just ascended that I overcame the terror that pinned me in place, turned, and ran. My feet crashed upon the iron catwalk, which shook and shuddered beneath me. But I didn't care. My only priority was getting away from that monstrous figure, escaping the sound of the Abattoir Concerto, which still echoed around the building. It was this reckless urgency that caused me to rush onto the final section of the walkway between myself and the door without first checking its integrity. I hurtled along, spurred on by the sight of the door finally within reaching distance, when, with an ear-splitting shriek, the left side of walkway tore free of the ceiling and lurched sharply sideways. Suddenly, I was pitched toward the sagging side, briefly crying out before I slammed into the handrail. It struck me in the ribs, driving the air from my lungs and turning my cry into a strangulated wheeze. I remained slumped against the handrail, trying to catch my breath as white spots swam before my eyes, for what felt like minutes, but in truth could only have been seconds. As I slouched there, gasping, the catwalk creaked ominously and slowly continued, leaning gently to the side. Acutely aware of the danger I was in, I pushed myself upright again, using the handrail for leverage, yet just before I regained my vertical base, there was a sickening, hollow, wrenching sound, and the handrail broke free of the struts that supported it and tumbled end over end to the floor below, hitting with an echoing clang. I stood teetering on the edge, my arms pinwheeling to regain my balance, rocking back and forth on my tiptoes. A drip of sweat fell from the tip of my nose. I saw it arc down to the blood-stained wooden flooring, and was struck with a sudden crushing certainty that my body would follow. It never did. Instead, I was able to regain my footing, precarious as it was, and continue my route towards the doorway before me. I shuffled forward, gingerly, wincing at every noisy protestation from the catwalk and its struts, until finally I was able to grasp the doorknob, all the while accompanied by the strains of the otherworldly pianist. I breathed a heavy and heartfelt sigh of relief when it turned freely and opened into the room beyond. As I finally stepped free of that darned walkway, I glanced back the way I'd come. The catwalks were clear. There was no sign of the shadowy pursuer I had spied before. I allowed a weary grin to cross my face and mopped at the sweat on my brow, then froze when I heard the first booming footstep. It was heavy, the footstep of a huge being, and it had a familiar metallic quality. The staircase. My pursuer was ascending the staircase. As if to confirm this realization, a second crashing footstep rang out, then a third. Each was perfectly in time to the tempo of Lucien Mortimer's music. With a surge of panic, I pulled the door closed behind me, turned and ran, straight into a cold, damp mass of solid flesh. I cried out, shielding my face from an unexpected attack, but it never came. I carefully lowered my hand and saw why. I had run into a butchered animal carcass, which now swung gently back and forth on its hook. The room was full of such carcasses, each headless and limbless, skinned and gutted. There had to be at least 60 of them between myself and the far end of the room, and as such I was unable to see what awaited me there. But that mattered not, for I was all too aware of what waited in my wake. I had no choice, and so I cautiously proceeded, pushing my way through the hanging slabs of meat. My passage seemed to set them swinging, causing each hook to squeak and creak as I disturbed its load. I don't know what's worse, the fact that together the chorus of meat hooks played the Abattoir Concerto, or the fact that part of me was thrilled to hear it again. Nonetheless, I forged on, plunging deep into the meat locker, searching for an exit, seeking some kind of escape route. The room now seemed to stretch to an impossible size, the hanging carcasses creating a never-ending labyrinth. Time and time again I cried out as I detected movement from the corner of my eye, only to realize it was simply one of the slabs of meat swinging back and forth. I became hopelessly lost, running into the clammy hunks of beef and pork, leaving my palms pink with the blood that still oozed from them. All about me the hooks creaked away, singing Mortimer's song to me. The Abattoir Concerto was now rising in pitch and tempo, building towards a thunderous crescendo, a moment I longed for as much as I dreaded. And then it came. With a savage crash, I heard the door behind me explode into fragments of timber. The thing that was hunting me was now inside the room. I heard it bearing down on me, a steady thunking noise as it ripped into the meat behind me. It was the sound of a cleaver in flesh. I panicked then. Running blindly forward, desperate to escape my pursuer. The swinging, heavy slabs of meat jostled me, buffeting me from all sides. Now my hands and clothes were drenched in blood. The meat here seemed fresher, the flesh wetter. I didn't pause to ponder this, though. Instead, I was fleeing for my life, my very soul, and nothing would hinder my flight. That was until the face appeared before me. I screamed again, slamming into the individual who had materialized before me. I felt in that moment that my life was over, that the monstrous huntman sent by the infernal pianist had found me at last and would soon end my existence. But I was wrong, for the face was not that of the predator. It was one of his prey. As I gagged in horror, I realized that the body before me was quite dead. A naked man missing his limbs, his abdomen sliced wide open, and his innards filleted. His eyes were wide, lifeless, yet filled with terror, while his mouth was stretched open in a silent and eternal scream. "Oh no," I cried, glancing about me and finally looking at the hanging meat that surrounded me. Human corpses hung all around. Arms drooped limply from the hooks, the hands pointing to the blood-soaked floor beneath. Legs hung, dripping blood from the fleshy wounds in the place at which they would join hips. Carved torsos swung gently back and forth, in time to the still-building strains of the Abattoir Concerto. But building to what? I could not stay here and wait to see, for I knew it would spell the end of me. So on I charged, shouldering aside the human remains that made up the butcher's macabre display. As I did, the sound of my pursuer's blade grew louder and louder, closer and closer. I might have gone a little mad during that hopeless retreat through the hanging dead, weeping and screaming as I ran from the thing behind me. It was as close to the underworld as I could imagine. And the experience broke something inside my mind, a piece that has yet to heal even now. Yet at the point I thought I could take no more, I saw it. The doorway that had eluded me for so long, and beyond it a staircase. I almost wept with relief and hurried towards it. As I drew close, I was finally able to see the walls, or more precisely, I was able to see the symbols crudely carved into them by blades, or daubed upon them in blood. They were ancient sigils, words and hexes of great power, the arcane alphabet of the occult. The individuals who had carved them had taken symbols from dozens of ancient civilizations, combining them into something new, yet older than humanity itself. These symbols were the gateway. The sacrifices had simply been the key. Finally, I stumbled through the dark archway of the doorway. I cast a fearful look behind me. Among the swinging cadavers, something vast and dark surged towards me, trailing chains and hooks and blood. With no time to catch my breath, I hurried up the steep wooden stairs, stomping up a dirty cloud of thick dust as I climbed. The staircase was dark and poorly lit, but a flickering glow ahead guided my feet. Still, the Abattoir Concerto played louder and louder. It was only when I emerged into the dim chamber atop the stairs that I saw why. The room was empty, except for one piece of furniture, a large grand piano, topped with an ornate candelabra. Fat, waxy candles dripping down its sides and casting a small halo of light about the piano. Beyond the light, there was nothing but blackness, a bottomless, endless abyss. At first, I couldn't see the pianist. I thought that the piano might even be playing itself. As unnatural and unnerving as that might sound, I wish it had been the case. For as I stared at the piano, open-mouthed and sweat-soaked, I finally spotted the source of the music. A disembodied and severed right arm, the knuckles tattooed, a glistening white knob of bone protruding from the fleshy gristle at its end, while the fingers danced back and forth across the piano's keys. I knew instantly that it was Fred Brown's, the amputated limb he had joked about in the leather apron, and I knew then that it was the thing chasing me that had taken the arm from him, as well as the leg, the ear, his nose, and who knew how many other body parts. As if to confirm this dread epiphany, there came that familiar booming footstep behind me on the stairs. I backed away from the staircase, knowing I was now trapped and cornered. There would be no escape. Again the footsteps came, crashing and slamming on the stairs, seeming to cause the entire room to shake, the candles guttering but remaining alight nonetheless. Each step fell perfectly in time with the severed arm's performance. In the shadows, beyond the flickering candlelight, something huge advanced toward me. Slowly, the figure began to take shape, at least 10 feet tall, dressed in a blood-spattered, long, white butcher's coat beneath a heavy, brown leather apron coated with gore. The traditional boater perched atop a head that sported unkempt, matted black hair and a long black beard, the hat's brim casting the man's face in shadow. The giant ascended the stairs, slowly, almost nonchalantly. He trailed chains behind him, each secured by barbed meat hooks that pierced his flesh, dark, blackish blood dripping from him as he came. In each hand he held a huge, cruel cleaver, the blade unnaturally sharp and gleaming hungrily in the dim light. "Oh no," I whispered despairingly. "No, no, 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 no." Finally, Lucian Mortimer reached the top of the stairs. As the diabolical being before me raised the cleavers to each side, his posture a blasphemous mockery of the crucifixion, the candlelight should have illuminated his face, but the shadows clung to Mortimer's visage as if they belonged together. The only light to pierce the gloom beneath the boulder came in the form of 2 pinpricks of blue fire that blazed malevolently at me from the butcher's eyes. There was a humor there, a burning, sadistic madness matched in its intensity only by the cold, psychotic cruelty also present in these glinting orbs. That gaze promised savage, unholy desecration of my flesh, an inevitable slaughter that would cause suffering beyond measure. And then, with unnatural speed, Mortimer swept towards me, cleavers raised high. I awoke with a start, crying out and clutching at my chest as if to stop my pounding heart from breaking free. As I sat up, frantically looking about me, it took a few moments to recognize my bedroom, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of breaking dawn. When at last I did, I breathed a long, shuddering sigh of relief that seemed to sap me of what little strength I had left. The dream was so realistic, so lifelike, I honestly felt my very life was in danger. I sat there, gasping for breath for some time, before finally feeling that the worst had passed. I was wrong. From deep in my house, I heard the familiar sound of a piano. My piano. And the pianist was playing the Abattoir Concerto. A sick feeling washed over me. My earlier tranquility dashed, my mind crashing headlong back into a state of crippling panic. It was during that moment that I first noticed the thin red rivulets that tracked down the front of the white dresser beside my bed. Confused, my gaze was drawn to the top, where I finally laid eyes on these sordid objects neatly arranged upon its surface. Somebody had placed a number of thick cuts of meat there. They were lean, fresh cuts, at least a dozen sizable discs of meat with a thick piece of white bone in the center. Each was a deep reddish pink, streaked through with a thin marbling of fat, and glistened in the wan light. This was meat of the highest quality, work of which any butcher would be proud. My brow furrowed in confusion, and as the pianist played on, I moved to get out of bed, to investigate the odd meat and origin of the music. I knew instantly that something was wrong. The sheet shifting away in a way that felt unusual. Glancing down, the familiar shape of my body looked different. "No," I whispered, too afraid to pull back the sheets, but knowing I had to. "No, no, 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 no." Steeling myself, sweat dripping down the small of my back, I pulled the sheet away. I gazed at the stumps where legs had been for a long time, not able to make sense of what I was seeing. Each thigh ended just above the knee, expertly amputated by a surgeon of considerable skill, with neat, fresh stitches drawing the angry red skin together and sealing off the wounds. Then it came to me, and I screamed, over and over, screaming until my voice became hoarse, my vocal cords bloody in my throat. I wept uncontrollably at the ruination of my body, clenching my fists and shaking my head in a dumbly futile gesture of denial. It was as I shook my head that my eyes again came to rest on the chops on my dresser. Beautifully prepared cuts of meat bone in. Only now did I realize what that meat was. And I laughed. Madly, hysterically waving my arms in time to Lucian Mortimer's masterpiece, laughing until I thought my lungs would burst. I woke then, from the dream within a dream. I was in my bed, in my room, but there was no sickly yellow light. The room was still pitch black, the middle of the night. It was my own deranged laughter that woke me up, and waking into this, the real world, acted like a bucket of cold water over my head, sobering me instantly. I lay there in the darkness, listening to my heart pounding in my ears. It was beating in time to the Abattoir Concerto. Before I knew it, I was humming the piece, my fingers again eagerly twitching to play it. But I did not get out of bed and take the long walk to my grand piano. Yet I know I must hear it. I know I must perform it again. This was my life's pursuit, and I cannot live without it. Never again. Since I heard it, I will never be the same. Yet despite this urge, instead, I reached for the phone beside my bed and composed this post, telling my story to pass the time until my staff arrive. You see, I know that I will require them to carry me to the piano. For even now, in the darkness of midnight, I can see the oozing shapes atop my dresser, glistening by the light of my phone.